don't read fiction. Specifically, heterosexual men don't read fiction, apparently. This is a culture war thing that has come up repeatedly over the last however many years since like the late 2000s. And I'm really just now getting clued into this whole debacle debate because of a recent article that I saw on the New York Times that was titled, "Why Did the Novel Reading Man Disappear?" Let me just start by saying I read a lot of different articles about this to get ready for this video, and I will have them all linked down below so that you can read some of these for yourself. But I'll also start by saying my husband reads novels all the time. When I was growing up, my brother was a very avid reader, but today he is more into video games and streaming and doesn't really read that much. My dad growing up, I don't think ever read a novel, at least during my lifetime, but I saw him reading magazines and newspapers a lot. So he definitely fits into the men don't read novels checkbox. But I am a booktuber, so I see booktubers all the time. I follow a ton of male booktubers, so obviously these men are reading, although I will have the caveat that most of the booktubers that I follow that are men read fantasy and sci-fi, which are traditionally male-dominated genres. My favorite English teacher when I was in high school that had a huge influence on my personal reading taste was also a man. So my personal life, I think, both does and does not reflect this sort of clickbaity men don't read fiction. I know lots of men that don't read anything. I know lots of men that read and read fiction. So that's part of why I thought that this was such an interesting topic to dive into a little bit more and figure out where people are coming from when they say this. I think when people think about men who read novels, they think of men who are thinking deeply, right? They're thinking of like the Dead Poets Society, where Robin Williams, the young English teacher, comes into the all-male boarding school and like revolutionizes his students through literature and or unorthodox teaching methods and like really teaches them how to live and like love each other. So is that sort of thing disappearing from our society? Is Dead Poet Society even capable of happening in our modern world? So let's kick off by throwing this way back to a 1979 essay written by Ursula K. Le Guin and her quote from that says, "American men have learned to repress their imagination, to reject it as something childish or effeminate, unprofitable, and probably sinful." And I think that's a good sort of encapsulation of what people are talking about when they say men don't read fiction. That this is a symptom of toxic masculinity and how it has infiltrated our culture in recent years. But this debate has obviously been going on for a very long time, not just in the most recent articles that I'm quoting below. I'm going to be looking down a lot because I have a lot of notes from all the different articles that I read. But the thinking goes that in recent decades, young men have regressed educationally, emotionally, and culturally. Less men are applying for college than women these days, and of the men who do go to college, less of them are graduating than women do after 4 years. And then we have this shit pile of a tweet from Andrew Tate, who is one of the manosphere men, that says, "Reading books is for losers who are afraid to learn from life. So they try and learn from the life others have lived. But you never really learn unless you lived it. You must feel it to believe it. Books are a total waste of time. Education for cowards." So I think that really encapsulates sort of what people think in terms of what the toxic manosphere is telling men about reading and about reading fiction specifically, that it is not for them. You know, toxic masculinity says that men do not share their feelings. All of these think pieces that I read are basically summarized by saying that reading increases empathy and expands the mind, and can be boiled down to basically the fact that men are not reading is why Donald Trump was elected. Which is a lot to pin on books. and to pin on men who like to read specifically. Yeah, that's obviously not true, but there's a lot that can be taken in a lot of different directions with these sorts of arguments. A quote from the New York Times article that first got me down on this track says, "If more men were reading, the thinking goes, the country would be a healthier place. More sensitive, more self-aware, less destructive. As more American men fill their hours with the crude talk shows of the manosphere, online gambling, and addictive multiplayer games, the humble novel, consumed alone, requiring thought and patience, can look like a panacea." And it goes on to say that men do not see the benefit of novels and are more interested in the instrumental or informational, and less so in things that are made up. Which I think is absolutely hilarious, because a lot of these articles said things like that, but then also said that men aren't reading because they're playing video games and streaming. And so like those two things do not make sense together. And then a big part of the argument is that men aren't reading fiction because modern contemporary fiction is not written for men. Basically, liberal politics and wokeness have destroyed the literary space available to men, specifically straight men, of course. I think it's absolutely infantilizing to say that men are only interested in masculine subjects. Men are complex and have just as many, thoughts and feelings and complexities as women and other people. But unfortunately, there are some studies that potentially back up this statement. This says, a study from Nielsen Book Research found that of the 10 best-selling male authors, readership was roughly evenly divided by gender, with 55% male readers and 45% female readers. In contrast, only 19% of the 10 best-selling female authors' readers were male, compared to 81% female. Men also read fewer books with female protagonists than do women, a problem compounded by the fact that fewer books feature female protagonists overall. For example, in the top 100 children's books, male characters, human and non-human, in leading roles outnumber female characters 2-1. So men are not picking up as many things written by women, and women don't seem to have that same issue when it comes to picking up books written by men. Obviously very concerning, but it is a huge oversimplification to say that men just aren't reading things because things are written for women. But we'll dive into that a little bit more in a bit. The New York Times article also spent some time talking about how men and women are introduced to books is very different. They interviewed a bookseller in which the bookseller was talking about how when women walk into a bookstore with other women, that they tend to walk around together and will do kind of the hand sell method of like talking to their friends about these books that they read and trying to convince their friends to read them. Versus when men come into a bookstore with other men, that they all split off and go to separate corners of the bookstore. It also mentions how there are big celebrity book clubs, but they're almost all headed by female celebrities like Oprah or Reese Witherspoon, and that really the only big exception to that is Barack Obama, but he doesn't do a book club so much as just release once a year a list of his favorite books. The New York Times article also says that books by men, or books that are written for men, quote unquote, are not getting the romantasy treatment in bookstores that obviously books written for women are, that they're not getting the big, colorful displays right at the front of the store. And that book talk, which is exceedingly popular, is overwhelmingly dominated by women talking about books written by women and pitching those books to other women. So I certainly, I'm not on Book Talk, but I am on BookTube, obviously. And I certainly, when I am filming this, I'm not thinking about my audience being women. Actually, I think my YouTube stats say that I have a pretty good mix of men and women who watch my channel. That doesn't ring true for me, but it could be true, right? But there's also the argument that the publishing industry is overwhelmingly staffed by women, which is true, at least from the studies that I read or the articles that I read, that says that 71% of the publishing workforce are cisgender women. So that's a lot, obviously. But then the argument gets a little fuzzier in that, well, if women are leading the publishing industry, then they're obviously selecting books that only appeal to them, and therefore choosing books that are written by women and such, which just as a slippery slope of a lot of sexism that we don't need to get into. Whether books are written for women by women or whether books are written by men for men has been a bit of a pendulum in our culture. This was pointed out both by the New York Times article and a great rebuttal article on Vox. The Vox article was not written in rebuttal to this New York Times article specifically, but to all of the hype around like men don't read fiction. So the Vox article was called "Are Men's Reading Habits Truly a National Crisis?" by Constance Grady. And it was a really, really good read. So if you only read 2 articles of all the ones that I'm going to post below, I recommend reading the New York Times article and the Vox article, because she does a lot of fact checking of what all these other people are talking about when they're talking about men not reading. But she says in that article, novels have been considered feminine frivolities since the Victorian era, when women first emerged as a major book buying market in Europe. Novels, which were about fantasies that had never occurred and frequently dealt with love and marriage, were thought to be most proper for women, whose sphere was the home. Men, who would have to take on strictures of the outside world, were thought to be better suited for journalism and nonfiction, which would prepare them to take action. And then this is sort of backed up by a really interesting quote in the New York Times article, which says that in 1855, Nathaniel Hawthorne, who, if you're not aware, famous American novelist who wrote The Scarlet Letter, described American novelists to his publisher as a damned mob of scribbling women, and I should have no chance of success while the public taste is occupied with their trash. Which is honestly echoing a lot of some of these articles and think pieces that I was reading. So it's just interesting how things swing, right? Because novels used to be considered just for women, and then there was like the 19th century huge surge of male authors and male readers, and now we're right back to square one of books are just for women and therefore books are trash. So the Vox article, like I said, that was fact checking a lot of these numbers and figures that people were widely citing. It reminds everyone from the Pew Research Center study that went from 2011 to 2021 that the median American adult only reads 5 books per year. That's novels and nonfiction and men and women and everything. So obviously no one is reading a lot. And she says, here's where we've ended up. Men are slightly less likely to read than women are, and they're probably also slightly less likely to read fiction, although the margin is not the yawning gap it's usually presented as. Male authors continue to sell well and win awards, and while it's true that women make up the vast majority of publishing staff, men are overrepresented at the executive level. So that obviously raises questions about who's really making the decisions about what books are published. So that's kind of the summary, I guess, of everything that I read about men not reading fiction. And I do think there is a lot of things to be concerned about, specifically the lack of reading across the board, right, for men and women. But I do think that there is the concern that because of the rise of Joe Rogan and Andrew Tate and Donald Trump and these men who are like openly anti-intellectual, and that they have gained so much traction and so much cultural weight, that less and less men who turn to those figures will read over time. And I think that is the biggest thing to be concerned about, and also just the lack of literacy that we're seeing in our public schools right now, and the huge gap that is occurring for our children not reading. But that is a whole different thing that maybe we'll do another video about in the future. I don't think that men don't read novels. I don't think that men are not reading fiction. I do think it makes for an interesting conversation about why people think that and what it could mean if men stop reading. There's lots of societal ills that have led to where we are today, and I don't think books are the answer, but it would be nice if it was that simple, right? I'd love to know your thoughts. Do you think it's true that men aren't reading fiction the way that they used to? And if so, what do you think is the biggest reason why? Thanks so much for hanging out and tuning in for a little bit today. Hopefully this was interesting to you. Please, please, please be kind. Read more books. We obviously all need it. And please hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you next time.